One of the largest factors that determines whether our illustrations look good or not are an illustration's value range. And if you don't understand how value, light, and shadow work, then your composition might fall apart a little bit. So in this video, I wanted to talk about just the different elements to lighting and form and how lighting affects form, including things like highlight, your base value, your core shadow, your cast shadow, and your refracted light. So without further ado, let's go to the thing. So let's talk about lighting first. What happens with light is, if we have a light source right here, I want to use a darker value. If we have a light source, let's imagine that the light is producing outwards in rays. And these rays are going to go directly straight out from the light source. I mean, they can go outwards, of course. But for the sake of simplicity, they're just going to go straight outwards at a 90-degree angle. Okay, so let's say we have a cube. And let's just imagine this cube like this. We have a cube, and the light is going to start to hit the cube at this face specifically. Now, what happens is, now we have an angle. What happens with the light is, obviously it's not going to come around and in. The light can only really expand outwards from the light source. So what happens is the light passes away. Now, if we have two light sources, of course, the light can go inwards. But if we have a single light source, then it can really only go outwards from the source. But like I said, it is going to pass away from this side of the cube. Anytime you have anything that resembles a 90-degree angle, so say one of these rays is directly adjacent to this side right here, whenever it produces a 90-degree angle, you're also going to begin to produce a shadow. Meaning that if light is headed directly inwards at this face, you're going to have a shadow on this edge, and potentially this edge as well, depending on where the angle of the lighting is coming from. I'll just expand this just to make it a bit larger. Now, something else to note is that when you have a light source touching an item, the item closest to that light source, or the surface closest to that light source, is going to be brighter than the surfaces further away from that light source. Meaning that since this cube is facing directly towards the light, it is going to get 100% light across this entire surface. However, let's say, let me just do this real quick. Do this, delete this layer, and then turn this layer off, then do a new layer. Let's say we take the cube and rotate it. Now we have a rotated cube. And now light is coming in towards this corner. What is going to happen is that since this corner is closer to the light source, it is going to get more light. And this is what we call the highlight. Highlight also, of course, depends on the material you're using. But the brightest section of, anything from a fold to a shape to your arm to your hair, it is all going to depend on which edge is closest to the light source. So, this edge of the cube is closest to the light source, meaning that it is going to be more close to being 100% bright, whereas this edge right here might be more around like 95%. Alright. So, let's talk about that real quick. This edge is going to be the highlight. This edge is going to be more of like the base color. And we're only talking about value right now, so it's generally going to be the base value of the object. Whenever you're doing like a still life study, you know, a study of like a ceramic sphere or a cube, they're always going to be white, and they're always going to be kind of like this pearlish white. That way you can only focus on the value itself. So we talked about the light, or the side that is lit up. Now what happens as you have a shadow? Well, we see this right here, and what happens right here is we have an obtuse angle. Something that is over 90 degrees is produced, meaning that on the back side of that angle we are going to have a shadow. So if light is coming in from right here, this is the highlight, this is the base, this area is going to be the shadow. Much more similar to the other cube that we drew earlier. So this is going to be shaded right here, and you're just gonna see just a little bit of shading right here. Alright, now on this back side you may have noticed that I didn't keep the shadow completely dense. And what happens is, as you move further away from the core shadow, you're going to get either the base shadow and or refractive light. And refractive light is actually quite common. We also call it our rebound. And it is determined by the surrounding area. So any light that hits the surrounding area, say this cube is on a desk, if you have your shadow right here, you are going to have your core shadow. You're going to have the shadow produced by the cube, but light that comes in from the backside that isn't necessarily affected, or light that doesn't produce a shadow by the cube, has the potential to reflect onto the backside of the cube right here. And that's what's called reflective light. Most of the time when new artists begin to illustrate, what happens is they'll have their highlight, they'll have their shadow, but they won't focus on the gradient for the base, and they won't focus on their refractive light. It's part of what makes their illustrations look very flat, aside from other things like depth, perspective, different types of poses, etc. It's also partially the way you shape your form. So, just to I thought I'd put together a real quick example of what I mean when I talk about the light being perpendicular to the surface. But if we look here, the light is directly in line, or creating a 90-degree angle right here. So if the light ray is going like this, there's a 90-degree angle created at this corner, and this shadow starts here. But watch what happens if I just rotate this slightly. Suddenly this face begins to light up. Now if I come back here, and then I take it, and I rotate it just a bit more, you can see that this edge will start to darken just a bit more, just because the shadow is now stronger. So, this is what it means when created anything more than a 90-degree angle with the light, you'll have a shadow. Cap, we have the highlight, excuse my poor handwriting, which is going to be brightest point and closest to the light. The highlight's going to be the brightest point, and it's going to be the closest to the light. Obviously, again, depending on the kind of material you're using as well. Now, we have our base value, which is going to be the value as we see it. No, I'll talk about that in a second. We're going to have the base value. So, value as we see it. I'm going to do an example in a second with a sphere, but there is one thing that I did leave out because rectangles do not have this, or not as prominently anyways, because it has a sharp edge. You have your terminator. And your terminator is the blending point between the base value and the core shadow. And this is also partially what determines a lot of the form, which is why I said when people don't focus on their base value, they lose a lot of form, same as a core shadow, or not the core shadow, the refractive light. So the terminator is going to be blending point between base value and core shadow. Now, we are going to have the core shadow. And the core shadow is going to be anything that is 90 degrees perpendicular to the light source, 90 degrees or more, perpendicular to light source, and it's going to be the darkest point of the shadow. Right, let's just make this smaller. And then the last part is going to be refractive light, or refractive light. And the refractive light is going to be the reflected area past the core shadow. Okay, again, please excuse my poor handwriting. If I could fix it, I would. I could totally fix it. Anyways, let's get into some examples. So I'm going to show you how to throw together just a simple example area real quick. Let's think about we're having like a desk with a dark backdrop and we have a really strong lighting on an object. So, have our desk. We're going to have a layer beneath it. I'm going to make this pretty dark. If you're wondering what brushes I use, by the way, I use Mark Brunette's brush pack. I just like the texture. And they're a lot quicker than some of the brushes in Clip Studio Paint, even though this is still a little bit slow. Anyways. Create a decent amount of texture back here, a little bit of gradient. Alright, so we have our background, we have our foreground, and now we're going to have our object layer. Let me just create an ellipse. In this ellipse, I will create a sphere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this sphere around. I'm going to lock all these layers. That way they're just easier to paint. I'm going to make this sphere just a little bit lighter, as well as the desk. I'm going to make the desk maybe like that color. So, what did we learn? If we have a somewhat white, kind of pearlish color sphere, and we have our light hitting it, let me create a new layer just to depict light hitting it. We have our light hitting it right here. We are going to have our highlight somewhere around there. Let me just make the sphere just a little bit darker. That way we can make the highlight more prominent. Have a highlight right there. And then we are going to have our core shadow. But the issue is that the sphere still looks a little bit flat. Why is that? Because it has that refractive light. I don't know how I want to say it, but something like that. Now we have a reflective light. And if we come over here, the sphere itself is going to produce a shadow. Okay, so following on with the shadow is going to be a bit darker than the sphere just because our surface for the table is also going to be a bit darker. So we have this. And I forgot to mention this, but in terminology terms, this is going to be called the cast shadow. And now something interesting that happens with the cast shadow sometimes, depending on the material you're using, is that it can actually get darker towards the edge because we have that refractive lighting again. So we have the highlight, and then we have refractive. The lighting hits right here. The lighting hits right here, the lighting hits right here, and the lighting hits right here. But that same lighting can bounce back onto the shadow itself, which is why, as it gets towards the edge, the same rule that happens with the square, where light sort of dissipates a little bit, it happens with the shadow as well. Meaning that this cast shadow won't be as heavily affected as it gets further away from the sphere in terms of just being dark and having a reflective light as when it's closer. Now, something to understand is as you get to the bottom of the cast shadow, it's not going to be able to reflect light that much towards the base. So it's just going to be about as dark as it is towards the edge as it is at the bottom. Something to understand is that these are fundamentals. These aren't conditional for everyday situations. You will have different lighting situations where you realize that lighting does vary. But if you're beginning to understand how shadows and lighting work, these are the basics. And as the shadow moves further away from the object, it will kind of feather out. So something like that. And then just to make things a little bit more prominent, we're going to lighten the color of this table up just a little bit, just to make it seem as though there is a spotlight hitting it. That is creating its own shadow on the sphere. And you can see I'm still using that concept of core shadow because I'm going to make this edge darker and make it lighter as it gets back towards the edge of the table. From here on out for this piece, we can do some things just to give it a bit more environmental feel. I mean, doing this with the desk helped a lot. But there are some other things that we can do, which is create just a little bit of a reflective, I can't say it, reflective light alongside the edge of the sphere on the side where light hits. This is going to be brighter, and it's going to make it feel as though you're actually looking at the object in person. And then, if you've ever actually been in a workshop and you've seen still life drawings, you'll notice how strong the lights are, and that you might have dust particles in the air sometimes. So it helps to add in some dust particles, especially around where the light is interacting with everything. Stuff like that. Look at it. Now it's pretty. Yay. Okay. Another rule to understand is that I'm going to merge all these layers real quick. Generally, I think I already mentioned this before, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to use our contrast slider. But what happens is, generally, the brighter you have a light, the darker your shadow is going to get. Essentially, you're going to have more contrast. Maybe not that bright, but let's say our light is this much brighter. It is going to be this much darker on the shadow. You can see the difference right here. It is helpful to, of course, study real-world examples. That way you know what you're looking at. This is just a rule of thumb. It doesn't necessarily determine what you're actually seeing on the page right here. Okay, so now what we can do is another example, which is we're going to create a square, and this time do it as if we were studying a square. So get the outline of the shape, come down here, and then we can just fill it all in. Lock that layer, come over here, make it a little bit brighter. Okay. And not lock that layer, clip it. Oops. Clip this one. Clip this one. And where we're gonna have our light source coming from is, it's gonna be coming from this upper corner instead of directly head on. Similar to how the sphere was. So, do that. Ooh. This rectangle is a little bit tilted, please excuse that. Gonna have this. Then we're gonna have our shaded face. Oops. Wait. Huh? Oh. Okay. Anyways, we're gonna have that. Then, just so I can fix this real quick, gonna align this like this. Okay. Okay. So, we have our rectangle. Gonna lock the layer for each face. Like that, that, and that. So, if this bottom edge is going to be the highlighted edge, then our highlight is going to come from here. Oh, wrong brush. Highlight can come from here. And we can see, like I said, the edge closest to the light source is going to produce more of a highlighted color than the edge furthest away. So as we get down towards here, there is a sort of gradation, and if you look down at my color wheel, you could see it start to go down. Moving to the shaded side, remember that we do have our core shadow. So this side is going to be shaded something like that. And then we have our reflected light, or our bounce light, that is going to come up and give it more form. And then this third edge, you don't need to tamper with it too much, because it's not as heavily affected as the highlighted side or the shaded side. But you may expect just a little bit of tapering as it goes back. Okay, now moving into our cast shadow. I'm just gonna do this real simple. Go over here, just reflect the shape. Oops. Yeah, no, I want to draw that under my bed. There's that. Now, unlike the sphere, this doesn't have a rounded bottom side, meaning that this cast shadow here is actually going to be darker more consistently across than having a refracted light back onto the shadow itself, because this side is flat. It's not going to reflect as easily as a sphere would, per se. Or as much. I would like to use the airbrush, please. Okay. And another thing is that it is going to have a hard shadow along this edge instead of somewhat expanding outward a little bit more like it would with the sphere. So there's that. And then we have our details. So doing simple studies of shapes, forms, and stuff like this, you're able to get a good understanding of how lighting works. The whole rule that when you have a 90-degree angle, or anything perpendicular larger than that, that you will have a shadow cast upon the opposing side. And as you have an edge that gets closer to the light source, or is facing directly towards it, it will be brighter than an edge that is further from the light source. One last thing to talk about regarding the studies is value. Now, what makes the image that we're looking at so effective and cohesive to see is the fact that it has separated values. Just add in a little shadow at the bottom right here, just to separate it. But the thing is that this image has separated values. And what that does is it makes each shape, dimension, form, and the perspective, or it can even affect the composition if you really wanted it to. But it makes everything a little bit easier to read, and it makes what you're looking at more cohesive. Now, what I mean by this is you've probably seen color studies where you have an image that has two different colors, but they're of the same value. And what happens is if you turn that image into a grayscale image or a black and white image, what is going to happen is that those values are going to blend together and you aren't going to notice a difference because you aren't relying on color. Let me show you. Okay, so I have these two colors. I have a yellow and then I have a peachish color. Now the thing about these two colors is that you could see them definitely contrasted by their color value, their saturation. However, when you look at the value itself, what you'll see is, if I use this little button on Clip Studio here to change this to grayscale, these values are the same, or essentially the same almost, and they begin to blend into each other. There's not a large distinguishing factor between them as opposed to when they have saturation. And that is going to play a pretty big role in painting, because if I were to take this desk and make it the same color as the shape. And then I take the background and I make it a color similar to the shape. It starts to become a lot harder to distinguish it from its surroundings, because you start to lose your boundary edges in important areas. Areas like right here. Areas like right here, areas like right here. They start to blend into each other and you aren't able to separate them. You don't have that much sense of depth that you would when you're using different values. And you'll see this a lot when mangakas are drawing, is that they'll separate things in a way that's cohesive and easy to understand. And you'll see this a lot where if a mangaka might have like a mountain range. So let's say we're doing one mountain, and then we'll do this in a specific color. Then we do two mountains, we're gonna put this one behind it. Or actually, let's just do this. Yeah, let's copy and paste these. And so, mountain one is going to go right here. And this one is going to go right here. Then, this one I want to have in front. This mountain. See, this is the thing. It's like, I'm trying to think about how I want to separate these layers, but I can't because I don't have anything to distinguish it with. That's what having value helps to do. So, this is my front mountain, and this is my second mountain. So I might move this back here like this. Then I have my third mountain. And this one is in the very back. So, for my first mountain, I might make it of a darker value. I'm gonna lock my layer, make it of a darker value. It starts to get just a little bit brighter. Or actually, let's just go darker from the top. Alright, so there's that. Then lock the layer for this mountain. Then it's just gonna get a little bit lighter as it goes behind. And then make this mountain even lighter. And so this is something that you'll see often as you're doing like landscape studies, is that because of things like the atmosphere or its surroundings, the further away landscape gets away from us, maybe there's mist in the air that is affecting the way the light hits it, the mountain itself. There's a lot to consider. We're not going to get into that. But generally the things further away they are, the less value they have. They start to blend in with the atmosphere and everything in the air that the light hits. That's why this furthest mountain back here is going to be a lot less defined than this closest mountain. Because of this, it's really important to consider what values you're using when you're painting. So, like, even if you're painting in color, it does help to switch your illustration to grayscale every so often. That way you can see where different things blend in. Something you may have noticed is certain people, illustrators, if they have a character right here, they might create like a lighting effect behind the character. It helps them pop a little bit more, but it also separates them from the background. And I'm sure if you flip that illustration into grayscale, you could see that there's a lot more definition between the background and the character than if you had this lighting effect here. In this case scenario, it doesn't work that much. Having the darker background does help, but it is relative to the situation. learning about value is essential if you want to make sure that your illustration has good form and good perspective. Something else to consider about value is that you can use it as a focal point. Having a bright value, like right here, this draws our eyes in. Generally anyways, the brighter part of an illustration is the thing that we recognize first, as opposed to the darker elements. Back here, you may not have noticed these at first as compared to the rectangle itself. That, also surrounded by the darker elements, helps support the rectangle and pop it out closer to the viewer. So in the end, I'd highly recommend, taking illustrations from your favorite artists, taking photographs, taking your own illustrations, and then just switching them to grayscale and looking at them and studying them and trying to recreate them. Look at how things are separated by contrast, how values in the background are different from values in the foreground and from the form, and how shadow, light, bounce lighting, highlights, and the base value are affected in different kinds of scenarios. Like, say I were to take my cube here, and maybe I wanted to place an object just adjacent to it. Let's say this is like a finger or something. Do it the same color as this. So say I have like a finger right here, and it is interacting with everything. This finger that is getting light now has the potential to reflect onto the backside of the square. So now the reflective light is going to change. And now it might be, in fact, brighter right here because the finger exists. So there are different conditions which affect reflection, how lighting works, and it's all about the environments and the things surrounding the form. So it is important to study instead of trying to apply these concepts as fundamentals, but having it as a fundamental is setting a baseline, and using the fundamental alone, disregarding studying, will definitely help improve your illustrations. In the next video, I will be applying these concepts into a full illustration, and then from then on, go into coloring that illustration. But for now, I just wanted to touch down on this because I realized as I was making that other video, it wasn't necessarily making sense. And so without having external information that talks about like how value, lighting, and shading works, trying to talk about how to paint in grayscale does not make sense at all. So with that being said, if there's anything I said or talked about in this video that didn't make sense or something that I missed that you want to talk about, please leave a question in the comments below and I'll try and get to it. But I will be seeing you guys in the next one. Thank you.